Well, good evening, and welcome to the National Aquarium and the Marjorie Limbank Lecture Series of 2016, which begins tonight with a special tribute to the National Park Service's centennial celebration. I am Chris Holland. I'm the new Chief Conservation Officer at the Aquarium, so I am particularly excited to be here, and I look forward to getting to know many of you over the course of the year and the years to come. The Marjorie Limbank Lecture Series was established by the Bank family to honor the memory of Marjorie Limbank. Marjorie was an avid marine photographer, as well as an active marine environmentalist and advocate. She was passionate about our oceans and the underwater world. She wanted us to see what she saw and feel what she felt for the oceans. Unfortunately, in 1994, Marjorie passed away, but the Bank family decided to endow this lecture series in her honor, and I know it has been a deeply gratifying experience for the National Aquarium to have a role in helping to share Marjorie's love for the ocean. So, I'd like to take a moment also to recognize our members and donors who make it possible for us to achieve our mission of inspiring conservation of the world's aquatic treasures through our amazing exhibits, our conservation education programs. We reached over 20,000 school children last year. Our conservation initiatives, Masonville Cove, Poplar Island, and more. So, it's my obligatory comment. If you are not a donor yet and would like to be, we would love to have you. But seriously, we simply cannot do this work without philanthropic support, so we do appreciate it. And I would also be remiss if I did not recognize and thank the aquarium's dedicated staff, both the paid staff and our volunteers. In 2015 alone, we had over 960 in-house volunteers dedicating over 121,000 hours. I think that's truly amazing. So thank you. And lastly, I do want to also mention and call out Stephanie Mathias and our wonderful marketing department who helped to orchestrate this lecture tonight. So I don't know where Stephanie is because the light's shining at me, but, oh, she's right there in front of me. Raise your hand, Stephanie. She did a great job. So moving on to the lecture. Tonight's lecture, as we said, is a special installment. It is in honor of the National Park Service's centennial celebration. Yellowstone was the first national park, and now there are 411 official areas of the National Park Service, comprising a total of 84 million acres. There's a park or a unit or an area in every state, the District of Columbia, our territories, American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And of these, there are 86 ocean and Great Lakes parks found in 26 states that are entrusted to the National Park Service for management and care. Established for their beauty and national significance, these parks can serve over 11,000 miles of coast and 2.6 million acres of ocean and Great Lakes waters. Now, I did not know that. I find that astounding, and I had no idea, I'm embarrassed to say, that there was so many acres of ocean and Great Lakes waters, so it's very interesting. Now, this fact I did know. In 2015, our national parks hosted over 307 million visitors, and they contributed $16.9 billion to the local and regional economies surrounding the parks. So beyond serving as economic engines supporting these local communities, our national parks are quite simply our national treasures. They connect people to nature, they preserve vast ecosystems, wildlife habitat, and there are iconic landscapes. I mean, they are our national treasures. And as the National Aquarium seeks to inspire conservation of our aquatic treasures, the National Parks Conservation Association seeks to protect and advocate for our national parks. They are the voice of our national parks. Tonight, we're fortunate to have as our speaker Theresa Pierno, who is president and CEO at the National Parks Conservation Association. And she's going to talk with us tonight about how water quality and quantity gives life to our parks, and the issues that the parks are now facing, thinking about droughts and climate change and severe weather events and fire management. What does this mean for wildlife habitat and the migrations of wildlife? What does it mean for the visitor service experience? And what are the parks doing and thinking about? And Marjorie and Theresa, she's going to provide us a glimpse of this. So she joined the National Parks Conservation Association in 2004 after a distinguished career in public service and natural resource protection, and she's always worked on the water quality front. She has also previously held leadership roles with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, where again she focused on the bay and water quality. And she is the co-founder and co-chair of America's Great Waters Coalition, where she leads a group of 70 member organizations, of which the Aquarium, I'm proud to say, is one, and is working together to protect and restore waters in and around our national parks. So we could think of no one better than Theresa to talk tonight with us. And I want to say, as I'm bringing her up, that all of you received, I believe, cards to write questions on. So as you're hearing Theresa, think about questions that you would like to ask her and have a discussion about, because there will be time after the lecture to engage with Theresa. So thank you, Theresa.
So much.
Thank you.
It's great to be here. It's great to be here. I'm in trouble. There's a hole right here. It's even bets whether I'm going to fall in the hole before those. If you've ever seen me, I've fallen off a couple stages, but I'll really try tonight very hard. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. It's just great to be at the National Aquarium, and one of the first places that I came when I moved to Maryland was the Aquarium. Stayed right at the Hyatt with my family and visited with my children, and it really is such a treasure. And the Calypso is just a terrific ambassador for the Aquarium, and certainly for the important work you do. This year is very special for our national parks. This year is the centennial of the National Park Service, and on August 25th, I'll be fortunate enough to be celebrating at Yellowstone, which, as Chris said, our first national park, and it's going to be quite a celebration. But, for 100 years, our national park rangers and volunteers and people have been working really hard to protect the national parks. And before we get into a lot of detail, I wanted to just be clear about the difference between the various different entities that work, and particularly the National Park Service. The National Park Service are really our rangers, our superintendents, our staff who work directly in the national parks, and they work hard every day to make sure our parks are there for all of you. As well as our National Park Foundation. They are the official charity fundraising arm of the national parks. And in fact, the Secretary of Interior sits as the chair of the National Park Foundation Board. And then there's us, the National Park Conservation Association. We've been around nearly 100 years. We were founded just soon after the National Park Service. And we work very hard. We're an advocacy organization to really protect these special places. And kind of to add to the confusion, two gentlemen you see up on the screen started the National Park Service, Stephen Mather, and Robert Sterling Yard Mather was the first donor to NPCA, and quite frankly realized early on that these national parks would need a private voice, a non-governmental organization that could really speak up on their behalf. And with over 400 now national parks, it's actually about 411, which is quite amazing. Parks like Yosemite, Yellowstone, right here in Shenandoah, and parks like Fort McHenry, just right here in Baltimore City. In fact, a full 2/3 are cultural and historic national parks. And so while we continue with our more than 1 million members and supporters to speak up on parks, what we're really doing is speaking up for their funding needs, for the air, for the water, and to make sure that the wildlife continues to thrive. Because parks aren't islands, and they can't exist without a whole ecosystem around them that is healthy and functioning. And so some of our early iconic national parks were actually discovered and founded because of basically the water. And how many of you know this picture very well, right? So here we are in Yellowstone with the geysers and the bubbling pots of water. Truly, truly amazing. Here we are in the Grand Canyon, carved out by the Colorado River. And then one of my favorite national parks, the Everglades. And it was the first park protected because of its biodiversity and not its views. 10% of our coastline is managed by the National Park Service, and that is really a staggering amount. In fact, when I first heard that, I was dumbfounded. I just couldn't believe it. I said, how's that possible? And sure enough, when you look at the lake shores around the Great Lakes, when you look at the kelp forests of the Channel Islands, the glaciers of the coastal parks of Alaska, the seashores of Cape Cod, Padre Island, the wetlands, the Everglades, and the coral reefs in the Virgin Islands National Park, you can see how it's true. In fact, one of my favorite beaches in the world, who knows where this is? Yeah, and where is this? That's right, Trunk Bay, the famous and beautiful Trunk Bay. In fact, I was fortunate enough a couple years ago to do a sabbatical, and I know, coral reefs. I said, I have to go to the Virgin Islands, and I got to spend 3 weeks in St. John, and it really was just an amazing, amazing journey. But as we recognize the health of our national parks depends on that water that flows through it and surrounds it, we are working to protect many, many acres of wetlands, bays, estuaries, and lake shores and coastlines, as well as thousands of rivers. And I haven't even, the 10% of coastal shoreline doesn't even include all of the thousands and thousands of miles of rivers that are around, through, and that are so critical to many, many of our national parks. Many in America believe that once the land is built, the structure is set, and the park is designated a national park, that it's going to be looked after, right? That we don't have to worry about it anymore. Well, quite wrong. Unfortunately, I wish this was the truth, but unfortunately, it's not. This next slide is sharing some of the impaired waters. And as you can see, there's a lot of impaired waters across the country. And in fact, half of all of our national park sites have waterways that is considered by the Environmental Protection Agency to be polluted, to be seriously impaired. And what that means is it's not meeting our very basic Clean Water Act standards. So in this picture, you see Rock Creek Park, which, how many of you know where Rock Creek Park is, right? Just nearby in Washington, D.C. And we have fought for really the last century to make sure that our national parks also have the financial needs. And you can see you've got Turkey Point, you've got the Everglades down here at the bottom. And all of these are just having tremendous challenges with water quality. And as I said, they continue to depend on the boundaries, what's flowing through them, and we are continuing to be challenged at NPCA to try to really stave off some of these very serious impacts. Animals, just as water doesn't understand the boundaries of parks, animals don't understand the boundaries of parks. And so that's why it is so critical with the kind of habitat to look outside park boundaries. And for many years, the focus of our organization really was within the park. And for the last decade or more, we've been focused more and more on what is happening outside in that larger ecosystem. And so it's really critical to look at parks in a really holistic way. This next graph is going to show you a slide, Parks in Peril. We took the WPE posters that were done and we kind of revamped them, and we created the Parks in Peril campaign, which is really looking at some of our most iconic national parks, but then also looking at what are some of those threats and what opportunities does this administration have, particularly the Obama administration, and what are those decisions that could be made before he leaves office to make sure that these parks are protected. And there's some serious issues. One of, unfortunately, it's my favorite worst decision that could possibly be made, is Colonial National Historic Park. Now, Jamestown, again, just down the road, was the first permanent English settlement in America. This park is greatly threatened right now. Dominion Virginia Power is threatening to put transmission towers across the James River within the viewshed of Colonial Parkway, Jamestown, the shores of Jamestown. That is a view that has not changed. In fact, it hasn't changed in 400 years. We took a Washington Post reporter there to prove the point on a canoe, and just got to get out there and look at the water, and he was just, I think, blown away, and therefore wrote a very strong article condemning this. But I think the reality is we're talking power transmission towers that would be as tall as the Statue of Liberty with LED lights, forever marring a landscape, and it is very close to happening. Then there's Biscayne National Park. This is another campaign that we are focused on. For the last few decades, certainly the toll has been taken on the health of the coral reef and the fish in Biscayne National Park. And we've been working very hard to create a really small marine reserve area around the coral reef that would really improve not just that reef, but continue to help the fisheries in that entire area. It is so important. But as you can imagine, even though it is important, and I think we've been able to get more fishing groups and more people to come on our side, there's still lawmakers that are trying to undermine it and put legislation in that would undermine this very effort. And so we're trying to push very forward fast before the next administration comes in to get regulations in there that will set that and make it permanent. But in fact, all of our national parks are really, in some way, need your voice and all of our voice. So we created, to build off of the National Park Service's Find Your Park, and many of you may know this, they've also established an Every Kid in the Park, so every fourth grader can go online and get a free park pass and take their family for the entire year for free to all of our national parks. So I think that's terrific, and I encourage you to take advantage of it. But we're encouraging people that once you get out and you find your favorite park, that we want you to find your voice, to make sure that you let your voice be heard, whether it's a letter to a member of Congress, whether it's to tell your friends and others to support the national parks, or whether it's you join us at NPCA, because we certainly need more supporters to help us with this effort. And as part of it, we have hosted many cleanups. We have more than 100 events that we're doing and really leading the charge on, as well as hundreds of others that we're participating in. And we're also doing something where we teach them, we get out in the park, and many times it's a trail building or cleaning up a park. But then we also do something called Civic Voice lessons, which is really helping young people to find their own voices and learn how they can stand up and really support these very important places. And now I'd like to show you a video that's just from a few months ago that are children in an area outside of Biscayne Bay. And many of them had never been to the park before, even though they lived very close. And this is a very common story, particularly in many urban communities around the country. And you'll see the tremendous impact that it had on them.
I'm inspired by the beauty of nature, the way that it keeps like pushing and it just keeps going. It's an inspiration for me to keep going myself. I feel one with everything around me.
There are a lot of children in Miami who have never seen the ocean, much less know that there's a whole system of national parks waiting for them to explore.
We work quite a bit with giving these children and young adults the opportunity to learn what a national park is, to get outside, to explore, to recreate, and to ask questions and to really learn about all of these amazing things that are right there in their backyards.
The most striking elements is how many of our local youth have never been here before. They don't know the story and they certainly don't understand that it's a national park, that it's their national park.
I've been to this park before, but I've never been out to sea on a boat or anything, so it was really cool to go to another part of the park. The fact that I actually got to go further and see beyond makes me realize how much more important it is, and it's really important that we take care of it.
The first time I went scuba diving, it was a really fun experience. We went down to the reef and it was very fun.
This is an experience that everyone should have, and it's definitely an experience that once I had, it changed me, and for the better.
We expose them to different venues to let them see that there's a different part of the world that they can participate in, not just in the neighborhood. And that is the catalyst for change.
If the students are going to come to these parks, then their parents are going to come, their siblings are going to come, and then we're all here.
Success for NPCA is creating future advocates so that they take their new love of national parks, their value of national parks, and they act on it.
I think it's really critical because they're the next generation of people who are going to be inheriting these parks and these wild spaces, and it's going to be up to them to protect them.
This is government property, but it's public property, so we all own it. It's our thing. So it's important to kind of express yourself.
They found their park on this visit, and they will find many, many more. And we want them to also be taking, now as leaders, others in their social group and bringing them to discover their parks as well.
I haven't been able to do something like this environmentally enhanced in a long time. I hope in 20 years, 30 years I can come back and it's even more environmentally friendly than it is now.
It kind of gives you hope for the future, and you know, I'm kind of assured and confident that moving forward we have great stewards, we have great advocates for our national parks and the youth that we work with.
Do you think kids your age can make an impact?
Yeah, they really can though. Maybe one day it'd be no trash on our beaches. Maybe one day. One day.
Well, I feel confident, and even though we talk about all these challenges, when you see young people and you see what they experience in getting out into national parks and how excited they are about it, I'm confident that they're going to be advocates and they're going to continue the fight to protect these incredible national parks. As I said, our waterways are really impacted from a variety of activities. One of them is encroachment of development. Beyond the boundaries of the national parks, whether it's Everglades with the incredible agricultural impacts that are impacting that, and the degraded water quality that is constantly a challenge for that area, as well as demands of water usage, whether it's the Colorado River, the Glen Canyon issues, Lake Mead. The constant demand for the water in the regions of national parks is truly threatening their survival. And then probably the one that we've all heard a lot about is climate change. Climate change is going to have severe impacts to our national parks because, as we said, 10% of them, or within 10% of the land area around the country is in the national park system, and that's coastal lands. And that doesn't even account for many other inlands and rivers and things that are also going to be impacted. And a lot of this is irreversible damage. We know that the droughts, the wildfires, and the floods are increasing. We know the sea level is rising, and we're continuing to see coastal wetlands consumed, which are so important in protecting our parks and our land. Wildlife is continuing to be under stress, and we're continuing to see species within the parks moving outside park boundaries. And so then we have to look very carefully at where these habitat are moving and make sure that we have those protected lands as well outside the parks. So what's that going to mean for the future areas that currently exist? Are they going to need to be expanded so that we can make sure that the habitat has a place to go? Coastal national parks and river systems are already experiencing this today. Rising and falling sea levels, coastal erosion, and more powerful hurricanes. Drought, in some examples, are also having unfortunate consequences in our coastal parks. Last year, the National Park Service released a report. Basically did a study of what the National Park Service infrastructure in historic and cultural resources. And they decided that basically with the level of risk that is being projected, that they're looking at potentially a $40 billion impact of damage just from sea level rise and storm vulnerability from climate change. This includes places like Fort McHenry, right here, or Assateague Island. But it's important to remember, and those of us that work in conservation and environment and in national parks can sometimes feel like the doom and gloom. It's a constant story of threats and what's happening, but we've had some great successes, and we've also had some places that are experiencing very significant impacts, and we've seen reversals because of some great work that's been done. And here's an example. Here's Tamiami Trail. How many of you have been on the Tamiami Trail? Okay, how many of you have been to the Everglades? Aha. Well, the Tamiami Trail is that road that cuts right across the Everglades, and it basically serves as a dam. And it blocks all of the water from going south. And so the Everglades are being starved of water. And so many years ago, with a large effort underway, that's still underway to restore our national park and the Everglades, was to raise that road. So to basically create bridges where you currently have a road and create ultimately almost 12 miles of bridging. Well, the first mile, just a few years ago, was finally built in 2013. And I actually was there and was able to celebrate more recently going over that bridge and to see that water then begin to flow underneath. That is going to make a huge difference just in 1 mile. Well, just this last Earth Day, there was a wonderful ceremony and groundbreaking with the 2.6 mile phase of that. So that, you think, well, why has it taken so long? But there are businesses, airboat operators, and lots of work that has to be done to make sure that things are moved, that you're dealing with all the ramifications then of letting that water flow south as well. And so it took a lot of time, a lot of resources, but we're really making progress, and we're going to see more water flowing south. So it really is a good news story. And one of my favorites is the Elwha Dam. Does anybody know about the Elwha Dam? Yes, Ellie, I see, yes. Olympic National Park. How many of you been to Olympic National Park out in Washington? Okay, so several of you. About, 12 years ago, I went out there. It was one of the first parks that I went to when I became working for NPCA, and it was amazing to see this dam and to see how they were just basically blocking the ability for the salmon to go upstream. It was really devastating, the entire system. And so a lot of work, a lot of people, NPCA was right there and involved, and many years later, I was able to be there again at the groundbreaking where they actually kind of imploded a piece of the part of the dam and started the construction. And today, this is actually a real picture here, over here, but today this dam now has been removed, the final dam has been removed, and the salmon are flowing upstream. They're there now, they've returned to the river. So it is possible to restore these places. And then I shouldn't have said, because I always get in trouble when I say the other one's my favorite. This is the Chesapeake Bay watershed. This is really my favorite. This has been my personal passion for most of my career, actually. And I managed to come to a park community and a park job and still find that water is truly critical, and it is. And as Chris said, I co-founded with the National Wildlife Federation the Great Waters Coalition, which is working so hard every day to protect this incredible resource as well as the resources around our country. And our beloved Chesapeake watershed, we've organized numerous various activities to help restore the Chesapeake Bay. We've brought people together, volunteers, to do work and cleanups and remove 100,000 pieces of debris. I'm not sure how we got that number, so it could be a little questionable, but did somebody really count that? They might have. But we did a tremendous amount of work in the park trails. It's a lot, I think is the point. And through our Freedom to Float, which was really an innovative program, the Freedom to Float campaign was established to create more public access. Because one of the things that is lacking here in the Chesapeake is the ability for people to just go down to the water and to be able to go swimming and boating and maybe just hike along the water. And so sites along the Captain John Smith's Trail have been created, as well as in Shenandoah National Park, but more needs to be done to make sure that people really are able to connect with this just amazing resource. And then we continue with Find Your Voice to find more opportunities and to really engage with more young people and more individuals as we try to get people to, whether it's write a letter or to join us at a Find Your Voice event. You can go on our website at npca.org, and you have a list of about 100 events that you can join in and activities that you can do. And of course, you can always donate. I get in trouble if I don't talk about the donation opportunity. So, of course, as a nonprofit, we depend on our membership, which we now have member and supporters of over 1.1 million, which is quite a large number, and they're spread out across the country. And I really can't thank you all enough for coming here this evening and spending your time. And before we get into a little discussion and I think a Q&A, I'd like you to see another very quick video, but I hope it will inspire you to get out and find your park and continue to speak up for your park.
I will put one foot in front of the other until I can't take another step. And if I reach the end of the world, I'll jump right in. I will learn the stories of our history's silent heroes. I will stare into a campfire and think about nothing and everything. I'll forget about time and live with the rhythms of the sky. And then I'll be reminded of the vastness of time. I will crane my neck to look up trees and lower my gaze to peer into canyons. I will go places I've never been, and I'll return to my favorite places again and again and again and again. I will feel the heat of the desert sun and the chill of the glacier beneath my feet. I will invite my friends and family to join me, and I will go entirely on my own. I will take pictures of arches and mosses and dunes, and then I'll put down the camera and appreciate the things that cannot be captured. Like how the simplest of snacks can taste like a 5-star meal. I will abandon the GPS and plan my adventure with nothing but a paper map and a wooden sign to guide my way. And if I get lost, that's just fine. I'll get found again. I will reach new heights and new depths. I'll travel by bus, by boat, by pedal, and by pod. And I'll leave no trace. In fact, I'll leave it better than I found it. Because I know that if I take the steps to protect our parks, they will always be there for both me and those who will follow. The perfect place to put one foot in front of the other.
Beautiful. Well, I hope that you're all feeling inspired. I'm feeling inspired after that. So that was wonderful, Theresa. Thank you so much. Well, we have time now to have some questions and dialogue with Theresa. So I don't know if there are some questions, whether you had an opportunity to write them down or whether you want to take an opportunity now. So you all can let us know. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Well, thank you. Can you go now? Next month? Yeah. The earlier, I mean, obviously, when you go later in the summer, you're going to have crowds. You're going to have a lot of people. Yeah. Yeah, and so I have been there actually in June. June is a wonderful time to go. And if you go early enough in June, it's before the kids are out of school. The crowds are not bad at all. In fact, I've been there the third week in June, and it was still lovely there. And there was a wonderful flow from the falls. But obviously, it depends year to year, too. It's been a very strange, what can I say, with, what are we, a day now of rain in a row, just about, with a couple days of sun in between. So it's really challenging to know for sure what one year will be to the next. Yeah, historically, earlier in the year, you're going to have more flow. In the fall, if you're going to go in the fall, probably September would be a good time, I would say, or early October is also pretty. But then it gets colder, obviously. So.
And it really is a good question because it is changing with the weather patterns now. People are having to change and ask that question of when will I be able to see the falls, or if I'm a through hiker on the Appalachian Trail, is there going to be water for me? And it's having to change the patterns. So I'm sure you're seeing a lot of that.
Absolutely. And you can't just guarantee it anymore. You really have to
do your research.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. Well, here's one of the questions was what kinds of habitat restoration projects are typically happening now at national parks, and what are you seeing more and more of and the need for?
Well, that's a great question. And there are a couple that I guess I would talk about that I think people may have heard about, even the bison in Yellowstone. And so as they've rebounded and they're doing well, the problem is they don't have the area to roam. And so they would go outside the park. They didn't know about those park boundaries. And they would be taken off. And
read.
Yeah, and that would be it. And so we were certainly, and then the Park Service was also in a position where they just could not handle. They didn't have the land, and so ultimately they would have to sometimes ship them off when they would be leaving the park in large numbers. So we've been able to get more ranchers outside of Yellowstone National Park to allow the bison to go on, because they spend part of the season, so as it gets colder and colder, they go further and further outside the park, and then as the weather warms up, they come kind of back in. And so now that they have more area to roam, that's been great. And one of the other real success stories that's been happening is in the pronghorn. Several years ago, we got involved and have now really been kind of leading the effort to remove some of the lower fences in the ranches, and this is in Yellowstone as well, where the migration path for the pronghorn to Grand Tetons was blocked with all of this fencing. And pronghorn, while they are just amazingly fast, they don't jump very well. And so they get caught in these fences and they die, and they're not able to do the migration path that is so important for them in order for their survival. So now we're seeing those numbers for the first time in decades going up, and pronghorn are being seen places that they haven't been seen for decades. So it's a great news story with volunteers out there working with thousands of miles of fencing that they have clipped, and it's just really quite an incredible story.
No, it is a magnificent story. If you have not read about the pronghorn, I would sincerely recommend you do so. And so it sounds like that looking at where the animal migration patterns are is part of the restoration efforts. And one of the things that you mentioned was that they unfortunately cannot read, so they are changing their boundaries, particularly with some of the climate change impacts. And just wondered if the Park Service, looking forward, if we do start to see these migrations leaving the parks where they've typically had habitat, if the Park Service would be looking at land exchanges perhaps too, or would it be simply expanding acquisition boundaries, or would it really be working with private landowners on trying to manage for these new species that are coming into their pathways?
I mean, I think ultimately it is a mix, and they're continuing. They've done some really significant work, as well as other organizations and departments that have looked at where those migrations are going, where they're seeing species moving, and where there's opportunity. And I would say most of the time, some of our larger western parks have other public lands around them, but those public lands, whether it's energy development or other kinds of intensive uses, it can't even be Forest Service land. So you don't always have the kind of usage that works for the habitat. And so it's really important to work cross-agency, and the Park Service is certainly working with BLM and Forest Service and others to see if what the plans are and how they can work together, and as well as organizations like Conservation Fund and others that do kind of easements and help with the kinds of land transfers. So that is going to be more and more common.
Excellent, excellent. And since we did talk about earlier in the presentation about the volunteers and some of the videos with the younger kids, but also the next generation coming up, what kinds of volunteer opportunities are there at national parks? I mean, are there new programs really recruiting volunteers, or is it still their friends, or how does one really engage and become a volunteer at a national park?
That's a really good question. There are lots of opportunities if you go, whether it's on the National Park Service website or if you even connect with us. And I talked about some of the Find Your Voice activities and events, and there's the Student Conservation Corps as well, who's very active, Student Conservation Association, that works with young people and will actually take them into the park, and you might spend a week or 2 weeks on an actual project. We partner with them, and we're partnering with them this year to do several really great projects. And we've been focusing more and more on diverse youth as well, and working with, now we've got a partnership with vet organizations in parks that we are working with to really help get out in the park, do projects, because they're great volunteers. They volunteer more hours than any other group in the public. Yeah, it's really quite a tremendous amount of commitment, and so we're working with those groups as well.
Very interesting. Well, I wouldn't actually mind sending my kids out for 2 weeks. Maybe I'll sign them up, but that's good to know. It's good to know. And, what is your favorite national park and why? And we're gonna, I might let you answer the Chesapeake, but I want you to go beyond the Chesapeake too.
Yeah, as a sailor, no. it's a really tough question. And I have to be honest, I don't have just one national park that's my favorite. How could I possibly just have one? They're so fabulous. But I can tell you that, as somebody who grew up in the East Coast, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and then spent a lot of years here now, almost 30 years in Maryland, the eastern parks, the Gettysburgs, the Harper Ferry, various historic national are really very interesting and amazing to me. So we have a lot of Acadia's, another beautiful natural park. But the parks that tell the stories and where you go and you really learn about history are fascinating. And then if you're into the big national parks, Glacier National Park is certainly one that isn't to be missed, as well as Yellowstone or Grand Teton. I'd say southwestern parts, Zion, Bryce, all of those are fabulous. And then if you get the opportunity to go to Alaska and you like the vastness of Denali, it's pretty spectacular to see some of the wolves and the grizzly bears and all of those things close up. Hopefully not too close, but I've seen them pretty close.
Right,
Yeah.
right. No, I mean, absolutely all gorgeous. And kind of on that theme about with wildlife and human interactions, given that there have been some recent incidences in the parks, for example, recently the visitor who tried to rescue the bison calf and the drunken men who damaged sensitive areas in Death Valley, which resulted in the, unfortunate demise of some endangered species. What do you think can be done to better educate the public and prevent damage by thrill seekers? And really, I would say probably by just the uninformed and uneducated. I mean, how, has the Park Service been discussing this issue at all of how to sort of make sure people are more informed?
It's a great question, and it's a really twofold problem. The education side, absolutely we need to do more and more to educate the public about things that you think are, you just should just know, not to put a child on a bison. I mean, everybody should just know that, right? So how do you
take that lesson away today? No children on bison. Thank you.
So that might not be on your list of what you are telling people that come to the park. I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't have thought of, even doing that. So people do strange things, and they do things, graffiti and just incredible things that you wouldn't expect. So it's the education piece, absolutely. The other piece is having enough rangers. We did a report years ago called Endangered Rangers, because the National Park Service is so underfunded that they've had to, do more volunteers, but that's still not going to take the place of law enforcement rangers. And there's 300 million people coming to our national parks. They need to be protected.
Right, right. And since we are a little bit close to home, can you tell us about some of the challenges that Assateague is currently facing? Can you talk to us a little bit? Tell us a little bit about that. Talk to us about that.
Well, I was going to say, and Assateague is one of my personal favorites. It's just so beautiful and wonderful. And just this last summer, I spent some time with my grandchildren there, and they loved it. Obviously, if you know about what's happening with the shoreline erosion and the sand that is continuing to be washed away, they've worked really hard to build up the dunes and to continue to replenish, and the beach replenishment. But, we don't want to say it's a losing battle, but it's a tough battle when you start to look ahead at what to do. And there are some that have said maybe we should let it go. I think that's a bad idea, but there are some that have indicated that there are places that we may have to let go and that are going to just be overwhelmed with changes in sea level and things like that. But I think that that's a big issue is managing that park, and then as well as the challenges with the non-native species, those wonderful horses that there's a lot of debate about, but obviously they can cause damage, and it's challenges, and it's managing them as well as part of I'd say probably the two biggest challenges that they work with regularly. But it's just a fabulous park, and one that I encourage everybody, if you haven't been there, it's close to home, and spend some time there.
Yeah, and that really is an interesting discussion, thinking about looking at sea level rise and where some of these parks are located, and particularly when you said 10%, and what happens with the management funds and budgets for certain parks. It's probably a very interesting discussion within the Park Service. But also thinking about water quality, there was a question actually a little bit for both of us, but we'll have you go first, is with the Inner Harbor receiving, continuing to have some poor water quality ratings, will the National Park Service and the Aquarium consider partnering to raise the water quality? Especially with many parks and their wildlife near this water body, what types of projects could be performed?
Well, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
There have been, it's a big question.
It is a big question.
There's the regulatory side and things that are happening with something that's called TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, and it's been court battles and trying to implement that, and now it is going to be implemented, and so that is a great victory. But there's a lot of stormwater management and lots of issues related to kind of the urban pollution here in the harbor. So every time it rains, you've got these flows that clear the streets, and when you have overflows with stormwater and things like that, it's just you have sewage issues and really point source kinds of issues here that are very dramatic. And there's been millions of dollars spent, lots of effort spent to try to clean up the harbor, and of course continuing to clean up the bay and all its tributaries. And there isn't sort of a magic bullet. We've been able to get to the point where no bay materials, dredge material is able to be dumped into the bay, and that was a huge issue that we certainly all worked on. I would say the Park Service can play a role in educating and helping to promote. We can play a role as an advocacy organization in lobbying and educating Congress to make sure the dollars are there, and certainly work with the great partners that the National Aquarium is in educating with the number of people that you have coming. So I'd love to do more and partner with the aquarium, because I think there is great opportunity to get more done. But it's a tough job, and it's a big problem.
Well, and we agree as well. And I think with the aquarium, with our reach of 1.5 million people a year, the education platform, the reaching to the schools, it's huge. But also, there's a lot of scientific work and studies being done by the aquarium on water quality. And of course, for those of you who are not aware, we do have a model urban wetland that we're going to be creating in Pier 3, which when you think about it, think of floating wetlands, think about urban conservation, think about placemaking. This will be free and accessible. It will connect people to water. It will improve water quality, one by the connection, but also by the citizen science. And so that's coming online in a couple of years, and you should all stay tuned to hear about that. But there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for really alliances, and it's going to take everybody working together in partnership. Yeah, so that's great. Well, here's one, too, is Tyler, I think, is in the audience. And he said, I was wondering, how can I help the National Park Service as a third grader?
Well, I think that the National Park Service and NPCA would love for you to get out in a national park. It can be Fort McHenry right here. It can be Shenandoah. It can be any one of the National Historic Parks that are close by, and some of our newer parks. The Sewell Belmont, the Belmont Women's National Historic, and there's just a long name, but it's where the suffrage movement really was founded in many ways, and they did a lot of work to get women right to vote in 1920. But as a third grader, we'd like you to write about, to show us pictures, share with us. Go to the National Park Service website, nps.gov, go to npca.org, and share your pictures, share your stories with us, and tell all your friends to get out to the national parks and to love the parks, because it's really, really important.
Very good, Tyler. That's the spirit that we want to see as well. Here's another, kind of switching gears a little bit again, but looking at another, and you mentioned this in your talk, the issue of we are in an energy infrastructure boom. And there is the issue of fracking and pretty much general consensus that that's contributing to degrading water quality, but also the infrastructure development crossing through the parks. And what is sort of your recommendations for what can your organization and is your organization doing to make sure that development goes in the right place, because there is the balance between, none of us live off the grid, but at the other hand, there are some places where development certainly shouldn't go. So how is your organization bridging that and working to make sure that we have good water quality to the extent we can?
It's a great question and a huge issue. More and more energy development happening on public lands outside national parks is getting more common. And so we've been working really hard with many organizations as well as with the Department of Interior to come up with something that's called master leasing plans out in the West to say these are areas where energy development is okay. And this is where it's not going to do damage to the national parks and the habitat is going to be, not be impacted. This is where it makes the most sense. This is off limits, whether it's outside the Grand Canyon, outside Arches and Canyonlands, and all these places that need to be protected. No Forest Service, no BLM, you cannot do these things here. And that has to be clear, and that's what we've been focusing on to provide more certainty, because that's what certainly energy community needs. But it's also with renewables. Solar farms, and we are totally supportive of renewable energy and absolutely understand the need for it. But they are industrial sites, the solar farms. They are enormous industrial that demand a lot of water to clean off the panels. There's huge water issues associated. Lots of impacts to habitat. And we've been battling one in particular just outside the Mojave National Park, which unfortunately the administration has given the green light to. And Senator Feinstein is helping to still battle this. But it's it's called Soda Mountain, outside the Mojave National Preserve, and it would have impacts to bighorn sheep, the desert tortoise, and it's enormous. It would create issues with water. It's not the right place. There are other places for that project, and that's what we continue to work on.
Excellent, very well said. And given the energy rise and other issues that you've talked about, could you comment on what the next decade is likely to bring, particularly in terms of goals and outcomes that the National Park Service is working on? I mean, what is sort of we're at their centennial. We're not asking you for the next 100 years, but just the next 10 years out. What is the Park Service sort of strategic planning focus, and what are they trying to achieve in the next 10 years? What is really the primary emphasis?
Well, I was fortunate to serve on the Centennial Advisory Committee for 3 years leading up to this park centennial, and the National Park Conservation Association, as the advocacy organization, certainly wants to promote and support many things the National Park Service does as well. And at times we are their adversary as well if we feel like they're doing something that's not correct, like allowing for energy exploration in Big Cypress. We think that's not a good thing. We shouldn't be allowing that to move forward. But I think that the reality is what we all understand, and what the National Park Service is really focusing on is the issue of relevancy, making sure that they reach the millennials, more young people, more urban populations, and do a better job of telling the full story of our country. And so many of the new parks that have been created have been historic national cultural parks, whether it's Cesar Chavez, whether it's Harriet Tubman, right here in Maryland. And there are some new sites being proposed as well that continue to protect and tell very important stories that need to be told, and that also make parks relevant for everyone. Right. And I think that's really critical, and that's a real focus for the National Park Service.
That's great, and I fully concur. I think conservation, we all in the conservation world need to make sure that conservation remains relevant for everybody, because we're not going to all care for the same reason, but hopefully all of our actions will lead to the same result. And so making conservation relevant is critical. And engaging young people, we have another question from someone who's saying, if I'm a young person and I do feel a connection to the water and oceans, which is great, what do you foresee as the best education and career paths to take in the next several years?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Well, you can never have enough education. So, and certainly, ironically, I went to school for business. Business administration was my major. So I learned about the environment in many different ways, from experience in getting to parks and getting out and doing it that way, but through things like ecology clubs as a young child, being in elected office and being able to really work on environmental legislation, and really getting into it, protecting through grassroots efforts and organizations and volunteering. I always tell people that if the environment is your passion and you really care about protecting it, then do something. And there's lots of things you can do. You can volunteer. There's many great organizations out there right here in the Chesapeake, and I dare name, but whether it's Chesapeake Bay Foundation or many other organizations locally, 1,000 Friends of Maryland. There's lots of great groups.
National Aquarium.
National Aquarium, yes, the National Aquarium is fabulous. But volunteer, get engaged. Also, you can't, like I said, you can't get enough education. I wish I had a PhD in biology. I wish I had that kind of background. But my background in policy and in business actually helped me to work as a good lobbyist, and as well as somebody who could speak to these issues in the way that many times could change the policy and shift the legislation so that we could do the kinds of things we needed to do to protect them. But volunteer, get engaged on the ground, and speak up. And that's why Civic Voice lessons and things like that are so important that we're doing to really get people to speak up.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And just as an aside for those that asked that question, was my former organization was the Conservation Fund, and the head of that organization was a master's in business administration as well. So it did strike me, and I think part of that is also thinking forward in the years to come. Whatever we think of corporate America one way or the other, they have to be at the table, and they can effectuate change in a very positive way. So understanding the business dynamics for somebody young coming in is probably very helpful, besides obviously all the volunteer work and education. So that's great. Another aspect here was, well, my eyes are going bad, so I'm like trying to see. This is a question that was looking at employees, what the Park Service does when they send folks on missions, whether if there's rescue missions, policing some of the disparate elements. How much does it cost for, and I'm not sure I'm capturing the full essence of this question, but I'm assuming if there are rescue missions that occur in a park, what is the expense to the Park Service as a whole? Do they, capture these? Are they part of the Park Service budget?
Well, actually, I shouldn't, and I'm not speaking for the Park Service because I don't work for the Park Service, so I want to make that clear. But I can tell you this is one of these issues that I know a little bit about, enough to be dangerous, but I will just say that I was involved with a team that had done a rescue at Mount Rainier. And I got to talk to them and about their experiences and how many rescues a year they do, and it was just an amazing number of people that, believe it or not, think they can wear sneakers and improper gear, and they're just going to climb up that glacier there and it's going to be just fine, and it's not, and they get in trouble and they need to be rescued. And if they do something that is really egregious, they get billed. They get a nice bill for that. But if not, it's costing obviously all of us significant dollars, and it is an issue because obviously the rangers, as I said, they're in demand and there are not enough of them, and so when they have to go in and make, whether it's helicopters or somebody has fallen and mountainside or things like that, it is very expensive and it is a significant impact. And there again, a lot of times these accidents happen, and I see the accident reports that NPS puts out. And there are things that could be avoided with just proper equipment, proper education, and not doing something that you really just aren't capable of doing. But it's a pretty significant expense.
Wow, interesting. Well, any last thoughts for us? Would you like any last thoughts you want to leave with the audience besides don't put your kid on a bison? Any?
Don't do that. Well, I just want to thank you all for coming tonight and really hearing about the national parks and the water connection, and for learning more about the National Park Conservation Association. I do love the national parks for many, many reasons, and I think that for all of you, clearly you're here tonight, you care about the national parks. And I thank you very much for everything you're doing. I know there are volunteers here. I know we have some of our own members here tonight. And I want to thank you for supporting us. And I also want to say that the world is changing very rapidly, and that with 7 hours a day is the average young person is spending on a screen, whether it's a television or an iPad or an iPhone or some other kind of screen. They're spending fewer and fewer hours outdoors. And more and more that they're seeing these pictures on television, but they're not experiencing them. And so I would just, not that any of that is bad, and parks need to make room for people to be able to go in with their iPads and iPhones and have Wi-Fi connection, but we also need to connect with nature. It's critically important for us to be able, as humans, to connect with nature. And so as parents and grandparents, I would encourage you to get your kids out into the parks early and often, as much as possible. So
That's right.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. That was really wonderful, Theresa. Again, it was inspiring. That's the word that comes to my mind. And I hope that all of you enjoyed this. And the parks are just an incredible place. And we look forward to the next 100 years. And we at the Aquarium look forward to partnering with you. And for those of you who come to our lectures, thank you. The Marjorie Lindbank Lecture Series, the next one will come up starting in August, so please look out for it. It will be a fall series, essentially, and please look out for emails and information about that in the future. So thank you all tonight. Safe travels.